Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, Beyond the Simple View, Exploring Implications for Instruction. My name is Karen Deary, and I'm joined by my colleague this afternoon, Nicole Kopko, and we're excited to facilitate this session for everyone. Before we start, we have just a few housekeeping items to review. You can access the presenter bio and the conference schedule on the Patent website, and the link has been provided for you in the chat. Please note that there are no handouts at this time for this session. Just as a reminder, the session is being recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which will include a 15-minute question and answer period. Please feel free to enter your questions in the chat throughout the session, and we will make sure that we collect those and forward those along to our presenter. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technology difficulties, please go to the Technical Support Guides area above the schedule on the symposium page. Your video feature and your microphones have been turned off at this time. We would love for you to tweet out or share out on social media all that you're learning from the Literacy Symposium. Please use hashtag PatentLit2022. And now it is my honor and privilege to welcome and introduce you to Dr. Devin Kearns. Dr. Kearns?
Hey, how are you? Hi, everyone. Good to see you this afternoon. There is actually a handout. It's a Dropbox link should appear in the chat now. And Nicole and Karen will probably upload that as well. So you can use that to follow along with. And so that would be the first thing, would be to take a look at that if you can. A couple of people in my first session did have a little trouble with accessing it. I think just be sure to just click download. If you see the screen that says something about Dropbox, you don't need a Dropbox account, just click on download and you'll be able to do it. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. To give you just a bit of background about me, I was an elementary school teacher for 7 years. I worked as a literacy coach and as a reading remediation specialist for kids with dyslexia, and spent a lot of time thinking about how can we best teach kids to learn to read. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how the simple view of reading works and how it fits into the rope and how all of that puts together the way we ought to think about instruction. To preview for you the session today, I am going to talk about the science of reading in general to kind of orient all of us. Now, with a big conference like this, you never know what level of knowledge people have on the topic. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the science of reading, giving you some background about that. I'm then going to get into some of the sciencey stuff about the connectionist model of word reading. So I did advertise that there's going to be some technical stuff in this in terms of explaining how the model works. So as promised, it will get a little bit sciencey, and there are going to be lots of circles and arrows. And then I'm going to talk about why that connectionist model helps us understand why something called whole language, which many of you may have heard of, but I'll say more about, doesn't work very well, and why doing certain kinds of reading instruction doesn't work very well. And then finally, I'll talk about how to actually use things that whole language has to do with in a way that isn't whole language, in a way that can be effective for students. So my hope is that this will bring to you some new ideas that are less familiar about how the science of reading works, but that you'll find useful in your practice and interesting and so on. I am going to keep the chat window up on my screen, so in the Q&A box on my screen, so I can see if you have any questions that you want to raise. I'll be able to look at them. And I'll also answer questions at the end. And for this presentation is sort of, I think slightly outside the norm of kind of the typical topics. There are likely to be a lot of questions. And if there are, I am happy to answer them because this is something that I presented parts of this before, but a lot of this is kind of me putting together a number of different ideas. So I'm excited to get your feedback as well. So let's jump in. Okay. So let's talk about what the science of reading is. At this point, I know most of you know, but I'm just going to give a brief background about this. So the science of reading is a set of facts that we have acquired about how reading works and about how to teach reading from a variety of different data sources. Some of it comes from neuroscience, where we know that there's a reading circuit in the brain about how we process words. Some of it is from education science. We've learned about how best to provide instruction for kids who have reading difficulty, and some comes from cognitive science. And the cognitive science I'm going to focus on today. There are computer models of reading. And Mark Seidenberg, who some of you may have heard of before, is one of the people most famous for designing these cognitive models of reading using computers that have been shown to approximate human data. And they've used this to create what's called a connectionist model of reading. And that has helped us understand better how reading works. And it has implications for the way we teach reading, even though we don't think about them as much. It's not, though, a particular program, this science, and it's not always what we do in schools. So what I'm going to talk about today is ways that we can exploit the science of reading in ways that sometimes we may not think about. To preview for you, one thing I'm going to say is that there is a way to use meaning when you're reading words. This may sound strange coming from somebody like me who studies phonics and cares a lot about teaching kids to read letter sounds, because when you hear someone say, I'm going to use meaning to read words, it makes it sound to them like I'm saying you should use a whole language approach where we just focus on word meaning and not at all on the letters in the words. That's not what I mean, but it does sound a little bit that way. However, it's a missed opportunity for us if we don't think about how we can use word meaning to help us when we're looking at words. I'm going to show you how we can do that and why I think that's true. As you may know, the science of reading movement came out of decoding dyslexia, for the most part, came from parents who were really dissatisfied with the quality of the education their children received. And their concern was that they weren't getting enough foundational skills instruction, that their kids had ended up having serious reading difficulty, and they felt like it had been a disservice to them by the school system because they could have been, those things could have been prevented. And in a lot of cases, they were correct that there hadn't been enough emphasis on foundational reading skills. Teachers had not provided them with enough support for figuring out how to read words. And as a result, the kids didn't learn to read them, and they ended up in 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And someone at that point noticed that there was a serious problem, and it became sort of an emergency situation. And that didn't have to be. There was a movement to change the law and to change the way things happen. And now at the university level where I work, we actually have made changes to the way that we are teaching teachers. I'm teaching it pretty much the same way I always have, but other people have been changing the way that they're teaching things. And there have been now some high profile examples of even people who design instruction changing their approaches because of the movement for the science of reading. In this, though, we've lost a little bit of a focus on the value of meaning as it relates to word recognition, word reading. I'm going to talk about how that works. And so I'm going to talk about the science. I'm going to talk about it in terms of the way to think about reading and the simple view of reading. It's especially important to do this because we really want to make sure that we can figure out what it is that matters for students with difficulty. Of course, we all care about good readers, but we're particularly eager to figure out how we can best support students who have the greatest need and why it is that there are multiple causes, but we need to pinpoint the ones that are most valuable for them using the science. But unfortunately, that's not what people always agree with. So here's the science on this. This is actually my own version of the rope graphic. It's not obviously doesn't look the same, but I always worried about copyright for the rope graphic, so I kind of made my own version of it. But so you all know the reading rope. I'm not going to focus on the language comprehension piece of this because you all know that piece and you know what that's about. But I want to focus on word recognition and its subcomponents. So we have phonological awareness, decoding skill, and sight recognition. Those are kind of the component skills of this. These are the pieces of the puzzle. And I want to talk about how these things relate when we look at the inside of the scientific model. When I look at this connectionist model, how do all those pieces fit together? How do we use our ability to detect and manipulate sound units? That's phonological awareness. When we sound words out, and then how does that change the way we build our understanding of the language, we build our sight recognition system, our ability to recognize lots of words by sight. So I'm going to fit it into helping us understand word recognition systems. And as I said, not everybody agrees about this. So for those of you who are less familiar with the history of all these things, there is a lot of disagreement, like a great deal of disagreement about how best to teach reading. And there's a lot of disagreement about how best to give students access to reading that is not in alignment with the science of reading, but it is people still argue about it a whole lot, and they call it sometimes in the reading wars. Actually, it seems really weird to say that we're in a war, but it does feel that way. And part of the reason is that people think that the consequences for kids are so deleterious, so serious, that we have to think of it as like a battle where the outcome is, almost kind of life or death. 55 years we've been doing this. 55 years we've been arguing about this. I'm going to come from the late 1960s, where the beginning of this was. There's a question about dyslexia I'll come back to later, come into the chat. So here's an example of the kind of issue that comes up in our world. So how many of you, I can kind of look in the chat to see, raise your hand if you have seen this Lips the Fish poster or something like this Lips the Fish poster. I'm just curious to see because, yeah, how many hands do we have? Oh, and now we have 8, 9. Okay, a lot. Okay, now a lot of people. So yeah, many of you have seen a Lips the Fish before. Okay, now I don't like Lips the Fish, and you may wonder, you may not like it either, but let's think about why it's not any good. So Lips the Fish is this idea. Lips the Fish is the idea that when you look at a word, you can do something. You can say the first sound or sounds of the word. Sometimes people say, get your mouth ready, right? That's the language people use, is get your mouth ready to say the sounds of the word. And it's sort of, I always wonder, what does that mean, get your mouth ready? It comes out of something by a researcher named Ken Goodman. So he didn't actually make Lips the Fish. You may not know the history of Lips the Fish is that Lips the Fish was a Beanie Baby, and someone decided to use the Beanie Baby to represent the idea of Lips the Fish, getting your mouth ready, because you could do it that way. And these are reading strategies that became popular, and there are actually like sets of Beanie Babies you can actually purchase for these. But Lips the Fish is the really important one that always made me really interested. Like, why would we say to kids, get your lips ready? Why don't we just say the sound of the word? Well, it's Goodman's approach that started this. So Goodman came up with this idea of the psycholinguistic guessing game. And this is the core idea in whole language. So again, I'm going to go over something that for some of you may be familiar, but I promise I was going to get into kind of some of the background of this. And that's what I'm going to do a little bit of here, is explain what this psycholinguistic guessing game is and all the pieces that went into why we have this disagreement. So the psycholinguistic guessing game this is at the heart of the debate over whole language. This is what Goodman wrote about this psycholinguistic guessing game in his famous 1967 paper. He wrote, I'll read this quote, "Efficient reading does not result from precise perception and identification of all elements, but from skill in selecting the fewest, most productive cues necessary to produce guesses which are right the first time." So what this means then is that if we think about this, we select the fewest, most productive cues. What it means is that we'll guess the meaning of a word if we have just a little bit of information. So when we look at a word, if we can figure it out just by looking at part of it, then we would do that. So now you can see why Lips the Fish was a popular idea. Lips the Fish is saying, get your mouth ready. When you get your mouth ready and you say the first sound or two, if you've already read other words in context in a sentence that will help you figure out what the word is, then you won't try to read the rest of the word. You'll simply immediately activate your meaning for the word. So if the sentence were I sat next to the purring, and then you saw a word that starts with a C, you could predict that the word was cat because you just saw the word purring. And so if you got your mouth ready, you saw that first sound, the first letter C, and you know that it's k, then you would immediately say cat without actually processing the rest of the letters in the word. This makes it really clear why in this model, you would want to focus not so much on teaching about letters and sounds, because the idea is to get all the meaning from the fewest letters possible, and with sound being sort of kind of almost a backup to that. And this isn't quite right. It's actually not correct at all. And I'm going to show you why. So This comes from the idea from, as I said, connectionist models or computer models of reading that were originally created by, well, not originally, but some of the ones for reading were originally created by Mark Seidenberg and some other of his colleagues and some researchers elsewhere. This is the so they call it sometimes the triangle model. This is the triangle model of word recognition. And the triangle model has 3 parts to it that I'm going to talk about. And 2 of them are the ones that we typically think about. So one is spelling. So in this example, I'm going to use cat, and then we have sound. I'm going to use cat for this, and then we have spelling, CAT, and the sounds, k, and t. Put them in slashes to represent sounds, which many of you have seen before. And each of these represents one sound. That AE thing there, that's the way you represent the sounds in something called the International Phonetic Alphabet, which I'm going to use to represent those ideas. So we have so the letters CAT and the sound cat. So when we're reading aloud, we make a link between CAT and the sound cat, right? And we also have the meaning. And so there is the meaning of cat. There is a cat that it represents the idea of a cat. You can see the cat right there. There it is. So that is the triangle model, is that these things are connected, okay? They're connected through these sort of intermediate parts called hidden units, which is really kind of a funny thing. And you may at this moment wonder, why am I drawing in these little circles? Well, this is actually a copy of the original graphic that look exactly like this with these intermediate circles, but they actually are really important for helping us understand why whole language is wrong and why the lips the fish is absolutely not correct. And I'm going to show you how that works and now. So we think about this as orthographic mapping. So orthographic mapping is the idea that we link from cat to the idea of a cat into the sound of a cat, right? And that's orthographic mapping. And people think, oh, this is at that level of the CAT to the picture of the cat to the sounds cat, right? But that's not exactly how it works. And this is also important for understanding why whole language is wrong. So we look at the word cat actually isn't just letters, but letter units within it. So if we look at cat, we can break it into C, A, and T, as you see on the left side there. But cat also has other units inside it that aren't simply just a C and an A and a T. You see the C and the A are next to each other, and you see all 3 letters, C, A, and T. But those letters could also be in a word like cattle, right? We see the letters AT, which could be the word at, it could be in the word cat, it could be in the word cattle, right? We even have cases where there is a letter at the beginning. The underscore there shows the location. So you might have C at the beginning of a word. You might have CA at the beginning word, like in camel or cat or cattle. You might have CAT at the beginning of the word, like in cattle or cat, but other things too, catamaran. You might have the word cat with a space at the beginning and space at the end. That's this one example. We have cat, the end and so on. So you can see that really when we think about the letters in the word, it actually isn't the exact letters that we're looking at one at a time. We actually look at the word in all of its component parts. Let me say it a different way. We look at all of the letters, not just simply on their own, but also in all the possible kind of combinations of those letters. We even look at the C and the T with something that maybe isn't even an A in the middle, right? I didn't put that on the list, but all these possibilities are there when we look at it. We are seeing those at the same time. The whole idea of this connectionist model is we're making these connections between all of the parts within the word. And this is true at the spelling level. It's also going to be true at the sound level. We focus here on phonemic features. So phonemes are the units of sound in words. I'm not going to go deeply into this, but I will tell you is that every sound in a word has a set of features that go with it. So the features are things like the place where we articulate the sound. So the k sound is a velar sound, and that means that we touch our tongue to the back of our mouth, the back of the roof of our mouth when we say it. The manner is whether or not it's a continuous sound or a stop sound, sometimes called a plosive, like k is a stop sound, or a plosive sound where you kind of, there's a puff of air that goes with it. Then there's a voicing component to it. For some sounds we use our voice, and for some sounds we don't. And so k is an unvoiced sound. So when we are thinking about the way we say words, our brain at the same time knows where to say a sound, how to say a sound, whether to use the voice. And it knows that for every part of the word. And it knows it for all the positions. So it knows it for this, the k sound, the a sound, the t sound. When the brain wants to make those sounds, it knows all the pieces that go with them. And the brain is used to thinking about and knows about C and A, or the ca together, and the at together, and the cat, but not just in the word cat, but in cattle and catamaran and so on. And so our brains are already primed to look at words in parts, like I have on the left here, and to analyze the sounds in parts, or to say the parts of the word. So when we think about orthographic mapping, letters to sound, it's not just the whole word to the whole, all the letters or to all the sounds in the word, it's the whole, it's all the individual letter units to all the phonemic features, right? So all the different parts of that. This then gets into this connectionist model. So I promised you boxes and arrows and circles, and here they are. This is where these hidden units come into play. So now I've taken the first few sounds and I've put them into on this grid here to show you just part of the puzzle. So it's obviously larger. I showed you a lot more units on the previous slide, but here are just a few of them. So here's the C itself, and the A and the T, CA, and so on. And on the right side here, you have the individual k sound, the a sound, the t sound, cat, at, and the whole thing, cat. And so what this means, these hidden units in the middle here, these are the units through which the letters and sounds are connected. I don't know an easy way to explain more about the hidden units, except just to explain to you how this actually works. So let me explain how it works with the letter C. The letter C is connected to all of these hidden units, and all of these hidden units are connected to the sound k, okay? And this is true for the letter C and all of these units, and the letter, or the sound k, and all of the units. So there are connections everywhere. I didn't even put all of them in. The C is also connected to this one, and the k connected to this one, and on down. So everything is connected to everything else. But not all the connections are the same, and this is what matters for how we actually read a word. So if you see here, there's a strong connection. So I made the connection stronger for some than for others. So what we're looking at is, I'm looking at the C and the k and the ka here. So what you're noticing is that for this, when we have the input C, it connects this hidden unit, and the hidden unit connects to the sound k and the sounds ka. Now this is just the C, it's not the C and the A. But what this means is that when we see the letter C, it makes us think of k in our brain, but not just because of the word cat, but from all of our other exposure. When we see the letter C, we think of cat. When we see the letter C, we also think of cat. That doesn't mean we're actually thinking, oh, that's the word cat consciously, but it does mean when we see the C sound, if we've had practice linking C to words, if we've had practice reading words like cat and castle and cot and so on, then when we see the C, we automatically think of things that have a k sound in them. I don't have it here, but we would also think of things that have a s sound in them. So when we go to read a word like cat, we're turning on our knowledge of the letter C and everything that it might possibly connect to in our sound system. So again, it's not represented here, but the C also has a connection to the S sound, which isn't even in the word cat. So what happens is that when we are going to read a word, we are looking at not only this letter on its own and the sound k, but the C and all of the things that we've ever heard that have a C related sound in them. The same thing is true for the A. We see the A, and immediately turns on the system to help us think about anything that A might have an association with. So you can see here, there's the A is the second one. Let me see, here's a better example of this. So here's the A, and the A has a strong connection here to the A sound. I didn't represent it, but this A would also have a connection to the ka, and to the at, and to the whole thing cat. And the reason is that these connections are distributed. So what does that mean, distributed? It means that we're connecting everything to everything else, but that some things are more strongly connected than others. So this matters because it's showing us that we are not simply looking at one letter at a time. When we see the C, we're connecting the letter C to a bunch of different sounds in our brain. It also shows us that when we see multiple letters together, that's helping us think of all kinds of other words that have that letter and letters in it. All that together means when we see cat, we're not just thinking of the whole word, we're thinking of the parts of it within it. And we're linking the letters to the sounds. This also shows why it's convenient in English. English is an alphabetic language, so where the letters represent sound, because it's pretty convenient here. After a while, your brain starts to realize, oh, that C, it says k, and it builds this strong connection between C and k. And so the next time you see it, you'll be really used to that. This is true for A. When we see A and it says we get used to seeing that. Our brain builds that connection and becomes stronger and stronger over time. Our brains do get used to seeing things that don't work too. Our brain will learn that A says A sometimes and says sometimes, like and about, and even understands that sometimes the A says like and was. So our brains get used to all those different possibilities. It doesn't get confused because it has not just knowledge of one connection between A and everything else, but A has a connection between A and every other possibility for A. And so our brains have a lot of information to work with when it reads words. And it can use the information about the letters and all the information it has about the way that letter connects to other sounds. And so having an alphabet where letters do represent sounds is pretty convenient. It makes it different than a lot of other languages that don't have a similar system. Like, for example, Chinese, which doesn't have as strong connections at the letter sound level. But this is the tricky thing for us is that there are also connections with meaning, and that is tricky as well, because when we think about cat and cat like that, the meaning there are meanings like that it has whiskers and pointy ears, that it meows and purrs, and that it's cute, or at least I think they're cute. And those are important connections as well. Here's the problem. Our understanding of the meanings of cat only occur at the whole word level. There's no connection at all between the C and any of these ideas. There isn't the case that the letter C represents cuteness sometimes. That's never true. So our connections between the letters and the meanings have to occur only at meaningful levels. We can't connect CAT to something, we can connect CAT to this meaning. We can't connect CA to anything. At has some meaningful connections, but at doesn't connect to any of these things, right? Like the at isn't connected to that. If we add an S to the end, that would make it plural. That would be something. But what's important here is that in English, unlike in other languages, Chinese, for example, actually has stronger links between the letter units and the meanings of the words. So there are certain things like in Chinese, a box represents in, and so and a box with a line through the middle represents middle, which makes sense because it's in the middle. The line is in the middle, so a box with a line through it means middle. So those kinds of things are really helpful when you have a language like that. The letter and meaning connections are strong. They're not strong in English. So that has a lot of implications. So here's what the implications are, and then I'll be able to translate that to instruction for us. First thing is that letter sounds are what matter most. The reason that's true is for the reason I just described to you. Yes, we have connections between letters and meaning. However, in English, it's alphabetic. So the primary connections are between the letters and the sounds. So when we're teaching people to read, the first thing we have to do is to teach them how the letters and sounds connect. That will always be essential to reading new and unfamiliar words. We have to have a way to connect the letters to the sounds. Second implication is that phonograms can help too. I haven't mentioned phonograms yet, but that is what people typically call like a word family, like words that have at in them. There are a lot of those words. And what we can see here is that sometimes people think about, I've seen a lot of people argue that like, well, we should only teach sound spelling correspondences, letter sound correspondences, or grapheme phony correspondences, things like, C says k, A says a. We shouldn't teach AT says at, because it isn't sometimes people call it synthetic phonics. And there's no rationale, that's not true. There's no reason not to teach phonograms, to teach the word family type units, because they're in a lot of words, right? Because I just showed you that we have these connections that aren't simply at the letter sound level. They're distributed across all possible units. And there are a lot of different phonograms. Lots of words in English rhyme, so there's no problem in teaching kids to use phonograms or allowing them to tune into those. So what I will add to that is Phonograms are only tricky because there are a lot more of them to learn. So you wouldn't only want to teach kids phonograms. When I usually typically recommend teaching high frequency phonograms, like, OP says op and AIN says ain and OULD says ud, especially things like OLD also says old, because it doesn't exactly, OLD says old is pretty consistent. You think it'd say all if you didn't know, that OLD says old. So that's the second implication, is that phonograms matter because there are lots of these units inside words that are useful, that are bigger than a letter. And so it's okay to teach students about those. Next implication is that letter meaning connections develop slower. What does that mean? We're not, when we first see a word cat, we're not instantly going to be able to turn on our representation for cat as quickly, because we have to build that over time. It takes at least 3 times seeing a word before it gets into our sight recognition vocabulary. So you see CAT and you say cat, that connection between those letters and that meaning develops slower because we don't have it at all at first. Our language isn't set up with easy connections between the letters and the meaning. Like in a language like Chinese, we have to build those a little bit more slowly. So it takes more time to build letter meaning connections. So we can't rely on that the first time. But they become stronger later, which means that over time, when we learn a lot of words, we have tons of words where we can instantly recognize them because we have that connection between the letters and the meaning really strongly in our brain. It doesn't mean we're not using our connections with the sounds. We're always saying the sounds. But what's really great about having strong letter meaning connections is it actually can support and improve the fluency with which we say words. And so having a lot of words in our brain that we remember what they mean and we remember the letters used to make them really supports fluent reading. The next implication is that orthographic mapping happens at many levels. So this is an important one because I think there's been a lot of discussion and controversy about orthographic mapping, for those of you who know what I'm talking about. And the argument with orthographic mapping has been that we're mapping letters to sounds, like these letters link to this sound and this meaning. But what I've just shown you is that that's not entirely accurate. Orthographic mapping happens at multiple levels at the same time. When we see CAT, we're mapping the C and CA and the CAT and all those units at the same time. We're mapping all of those things. So to say that it's just this one-to-one mapping alone is not correct. It is correct that when we see CAT, we know it means a cat and we know how to say it as cat, but it doesn't mean we're not activating other connections within that. But orthographic mapping is between the letters and the meaning. There's usually only one connection, right? Unless we have a multiple meaning word, which could go to 2 different meanings. But bank could be like the side of a river, and a place with money. You might have those two. Those are 2 different connections there. But besides multiple meaning words, we have this one-to-one connection with letters and meaning, whereas we have these distributed connections between letters and sounds. And related to that then is we use every bit of information we have, which means that whole language is wrong, a point I'll come back to in a minute. It also means that meaning matters and practice is critical. And the meaning matters is the kind of the key thing I'm going to focus on in a little bit. And I'm going to talk about practice at the end as well. So all of that is to tell us that lips the fish is wrong. And what I just showed you shows you that that is wrong because because the implication of whole language that we'll use the first few letters if we can is totally wrong, because we are using every bit of information we have. As soon as we see the word cat, we are looking at every subunit in the word to think of it. And so the idea that we get our mouth ready just to say the first sound is totally wrong. We're looking at all the letters at the same time, and we're connecting to every piece of information we have about the sounds and the meaning of that word at the exact same time. This is also then why we don't want to do things like skipping words, because skipping is based on the premise that if the word is too difficult right now, we can go ahead and get the word later from context. So it has that same built-in premise that like we're going to sort of we're going to see if we can figure it out using as little information about the letters as possible. That's not a good idea, because that's not how we want to be able to, we want to teach kids to read words, because it's not the way reading actually works. We cannot skip the words. We need to use the letters as the access code. And when you're beginning to read, you need to use letters and link them to sounds at first, because that's the access code. We're taking our eyes off the word when we're doing the Skippy Frog. And the worst thing to do, like literally one of the worst things you can teach kids to do, is to have them look at the pictures. I like, full stop. If you don't take anything else away from what I am saying today, take away that like you shouldn't ever use picture cues again as a strategy to help kids to read. It's bad for them because it is not helping them focus on the connection between the letters and the sounds and the meaning. It's focusing us just on the meaning, right? Almost not even on the letters at all. And so the kids are not making any kind of connection. And I know that all of you have worked with like kindergarten kids who've done pattern books. You've seen this before. You know, we went to and they'll look at the train station and they'll see the train station. They aren't actually looking at the letters in train station. They are just using their eagle eyes to find the picture, and they're not making that connection of the letters between the letters and the sounds and the meaning. It's just the picture. It's just the meaning basically without the letters and sounds. It also means that kids can get it wrong, right? We've all seen examples of kids like they were riding and they look at a picture, it's a pony. It's like, well, no, it's a horse, but I mean, close enough. No, not close enough. It's not the same thing. We focus on the picture, we're taking our eyes off of the meaning, and we're actually not getting out of the text what the author intended. So that's a problem as well. So all these things to emphasize that when we are focusing on, we're focusing on skipping, we're focusing on using pictures, and we're focusing on lips to fish, we are not doing what we need to do for kids to be successful readers. Yeah, so that's really bad. Okay. So the implications then for instruction are the following. The first is that we want to be really careful about how we use the words that we choose. The first thing I want to say is that we need to think carefully about when we use nonsense words. We often teach kids to read nonsense words because we want to focus on the connection between letters and sounds, right? And so I often do recommend teaching nonsense words for kids who are in what I call inveterate guessers, right? Kids just will not stop guessing on words. Then the best way to get them to stop doing that is to teach them to read words that only have letter sound connections and no letter meaning connections. Because if you don't have letter meaning connections, then the only thing you can do is use your decoding skills. So if kids really have a need to do that, then maybe do that. But for a lot of other kids, and I would say especially for multilingual learners, probably not a good idea to link letters just to sounds. We want to link them to meanings as well, partly because we want to make those connections between letter, sound, and meaning, because the meaning can be helpful to us. And this is the point I'll be the last piece of what I'm going to talk about, is how we can use how we do use the meaning as readers to help us when we're actually even just reading regular words. So we want to emphasize the connection to meaning. You saw in my description of the connectionist model that there is a strong connection between letters and meaning that builds over time. We want to take advantage of that. What that means is that we want to teach reasonably familiar, I should have said words there, not just reasonably, so we're actually teaching things kids are familiar with. Some of you may have been in my first session, I used this same slide, but I think it's such a good example. If you look at these words, this is kind of help us think about the fact that like, if we're going to use words that are helpful to kids for meaning, we have to use words that they're likely to actually know what they mean. So if you look at these words on the right, on the left, they are words that are actually from a real reading program that I won't name. And I picked up this list because I thought it was fascinating. These are on the list. It's a list of real words. If you look at this list, like you see the word candid, and I'm not sure if a lot of kids would know that word. I'm not sure how many kids would know sublet, maybe if they like live in a city. I'm not sure how many kids would know septic tank. Maybe kids who live in a rural area. I'm not even sure the rural area kids would know the word rustic. Hobnob, I don't know who says that. No one really says that anymore at all. And then a pipkin definitely isn't something any of us really know. I've used this slide before, or picture slide like it, and I ask people, how many of you know what pipkin is? Usually like 1 in every 400 people. So it looks like about 300 of you, maybe one of you will know what a pipkin is. That's what it is if you hadn't seen it before. So there you go, that's a pipkin. But that is not a word that actually means anything to any of our students, right? They're not picking up on the fact that, and they see the word pipkin, they're not thinking, oh yeah, that thing. That's just a nonsense word to them, right? So we're thinking about teaching kids to read words. We need to teach them actual words, not just these sort of made up words, right? We're going to use this, we're going to do this at the sentence level. We need to do the same thing. Something like polish off the gumdrops is another one I took from a real reading program. If you think about what that might mean, what students might think polish off the gumdrops means, if you imagine, students might think it means removing sugar crystals from the outside of gumdrops. You'd be right. That's also what my sister thought it was when I shared this last weekend. Turns out that's not true. You don't know, polishing up gumdrops means finishing the last of the gumdrops. That's not something even you were familiar with as a person. So yeah, we don't want kids to think it's gumdrop polishing. But really what's key here is that I'm thinking mostly about kind of the Pipkin word example. We need to teach kids words that they are somewhat familiar with. They have to have heard words before in order for them to be useful to them. And I'm going to say more about why that is in a little bit, but you should already have an understanding to a certain extent why that's true, because in the connectionist model, we're always making those connections between the letters and the sounds and with the meaning as well. I think it's okay to teach uncommon words, the ones that are rare, that kids are almost not or certain not to know, like you don't know what a pipkin is, like kids don't know what a lot of those things were, then those are words that we don't probably want to teach kids to use. If we are going to use less familiar words, my recommendation is to teach them to mastery ahead of time. So this is just like a teacher dialogue. Teacher might say, let's say some words we'll hear during blending. Listen, this word is discontinue. What's the word? Discontinue. Right, discontinue. Companies discontinue unpopular products. Bisyllable, listen, discontinue, your turn, discontinue. And so that is an example of how you would get students to pronounce the word correctly. So in this example, we're just saying it, and I'm actually listening carefully to make sure that the students are saying it correctly. When I say teaching the pronunciation of mastery, students do need to be able to pronounce the word correctly. If they don't pronounce the word the right way, they're actually not saying the word correctly. Hopefully you're not using words that they wouldn't know at all. We wouldn't choose them if they were words that kids wouldn't know at all. Discontinue might not be one they would know very well. They should know well enough to be able to say it correctly. If there's any error in the way they say it, then they aren't going to be able to use their letter sound knowledge well enough to figure out what the word is. So we want to make sure that they can actually say the word perfectly correctly. You have to teach the pronunciation to mastery. So that's a really key piece of pre-teaching pronunciations if you're going to teach kids words that are less familiar. And this brings us to the big piece of this I think will be least familiar to all of you in terms of how I would suggest we want to teach kids, is that in addition to doing everything we've talked about between connecting letters and sounds that you've learned about in the science of reading, there is evidence that's helpful to make the connection to the lexicon, to the meaning of words, right? So I showed you the connections model. I showed you that there are letter, sound, and meaning connections. We actually can take advantage of kids' knowledge of word meaning when we have them read. And it should be pretty obvious to you from your experience. It took me a long time to actually realize that this was true, even though I'd seen it so many times, that like kids are always trying to make connections to the lexicon, which results in some kind of interesting phenomena. So this is, I'm just going to play a quick, these are short audio clips of students reading or trying to read words and trying to figure out what they are. So this is a kid reading, I think, or a supplement, I'm not sure. Let's see, oh, no, sufferance, which is a that's a very rare word.
Suffer ants.
So the kid says suffer ants, but doesn't get there. So just kind of, it's like, I don't know what that is. It's a really rare word, 3 times per 100 million words. Okay, so fair enough that he doesn't get there. So that one, no surprise. Can't wait to the word because he doesn't know what it means. Let's listen to this one. This one is a little bit more common.
Swiftness.
So a little bit more common word and a little bit more easily pronounced correctly. Swiftness, a little bit hesitant, but you can see the student is getting there. He can link to the word a little bit better. It's not perfect, but it's basically that the word is familiar enough that he can get the word right in his mind. This is what's happening for us all the time. And there are even better examples of this where you'll see a kid start to say something and they'll get it wrong. And then somehow they just like figure out what it is. And they didn't sound it out a second time. All of a sudden, they just figured out what the word is. And you think, how is it possible that that happened? What's happening is that they are actually making the connection to the meaning based on the letter sounds that they already pronounce. So we actually can teach kids to do this. And I am not talking about using whole language. No, I know it sounds that way, but that's not what I mean. I'm going to say more about this. I try to make that clear with the connectionist model. I'm going to say more about it. I'm actually saying is, do not use whole language because it's a really bad idea. what we're going to do is we're going to talk about we want to try to do is to get kids to turn on the part of their brains that want to make these connections. So if our brain says a word and doesn't say it quite correctly, it's still trying to figure out what the word is. If our brain knows it's trying to find a real word, it will try to locate one. And there's actually research that has shown that whether or not a kid can figure out what a nonsense word is, what the correct pronunciation is of a word read correctly is really strongly predictive of their reading skill, because what readers are doing is they are trying to make connections between anything they say and the meaning. Because even when they're a little bit off, they're not totally off. They can use the information they've already acquired about the connection of the letters and the sounds, and they can connect that information to meaning. So when they're a little bit wrong, but not totally wrong, if some of those correct connections in place, they can use that information to get them to the meaning, and that can springboard their reading skills. So let me show you how this works by giving you an example from an assessment. And so I've done some studies on this, and this is from assessment. So this is Peter. Where's Peter?
Fast.
Oh, okay, where's Peter? There's a picture. Okay, there's a lion. I don't know. I'll show up in a minute. But this is Peter, a silly lion who can talk. Today, we're going to play a word game with Peter. In this game, Peter tries to say a word, but he says it the wrong way. I want you to listen to what Peter says and tell me what he's trying to say. All right, so here are the sample items. These are pronounced by me. So here you go. You have to listen to me in a different way. So this is me pronouncing words. I'm guessing you'll be able to figure out what they are. So listen carefully.
Breakfast.
I assume everyone figured out that's breakfast.
Weather.
And you probably figured out that that's weather. And
Shoulder.
you probably figured out that that's shoulder. So those are all mispronunciations. There's Peter. There's Peter the lion, who's the silly lion can talk. Very cute lion. And so you can see in all three of those words were mispronounced, and the idea is for students to be able to figure out what they are. It turns out that teaching kids to figure out what words are when they're mispronounced is actually really useful, because of what I talked about with the meaning. We're always trying to make connections to the meaning. So we have a word and we are trying to figure out what it is, and we sound it out, but it's not quite perfect because we have connections from letters to sounds and to meaning. If it's close, if we have enough connections, our brain will make the connection to the correct meaning, even if it isn't totally correct. That's what's amazing about the brain, is that we can actually make connections to the meaning of the word, even if we have even if there's some mistakes in our pronunciation when we sound it out, we'll be able to make the connection to the meaning if we have a meaning in the brain, because we have already some connections in place. We already know how to say the word, and we know what the word means if it's the word we're familiar with. Now all we have to do is link from the letters to that meaning also. We have the letters and some of the sounds right, but it's not perfect. We can then use our knowledge of meaning to actually pronounce it correctly. So there's actually real value in learning about the connection between letters and meaning, or in this case, actually even sounds and meaning, because this is about correcting mispronunciation. So if we have, if not all the sounds right when we sound it out and we're trying to read it ourselves, then we can correct the mispronunciation by using our knowledge of meaning and making those connections that way. So let me show you an example of how this might work. So let's see. Yeah, so I guess the continuation of that point that I just made is just that we always try to link. We're always trying to make these connections to the lexicon, to our dictionary of meanings in our brain, because they're built in that way. You saw that when I described the connectionist account. The letters and sounds and meaning are intimately connected. And we need to be able to do this, because when we sound stuff out, we're always wrong, especially with the long words, right? Almost every word in English has an unstressed syllable that has more than one syllable, right? So, like about, the A is not a, it's not sorry, it's not a, it's not a, it's not it's not even like it's a very short version of the sound, right? And that means that we actually have to make adjustments. I sounded out about, I'm going to be wrong, but I'm close. And so then I can use my knowledge of meaning to help me out. And that's why we think that it's effective. So Researchers have tested this out and shown that making mispronunciation corrections is actually helpful to kids. So I'm going to give you a couple study examples. This is pretty contemporary. People are still doing work on this. We're doing some of this work with my colleagues and I are doing study right now where we're testing some of this out to see if we can make it work also, where we teach kids to make mispronunciation corrections and then see if that's helpful to students. So here's the dialogue from one of these programs. So these are the instructions given in this paper by Dyson et al. So they say to review with students that letters don't always obey the letter laws. You remind them of their word reading toolkit. These are the toolkit steps. Say the word aloud, decide if you know the word. If you don't, think of the word that sounds like the word, choose a word that sounds most like the word you said, check, does the word you've chosen make sense in context? So you're actually going through, after you've said the word, going through this mental process of figuring out what the word might sound like if it's not the right one. And then you teach students to like do this with spoken words. So this is listen to puppet read words in context incorrectly. She pushed the door with her shoulder, and the students have to figure out what the correct answer is. And so then after you do that with them, you practice reading words with irregular spellings and underlining them to make the connection back to the spelling and make the link between the spelling, the meaning, and the pronunciation, and then learn the meanings of those words as well. So that's how Dyson et al. Did that. They did that with, I think, first grade kids in England. And then they do lots of word reading practice as well. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. Savage et al. Did a similar thing. They taught students to do regular word recognition learning with typical letter sound instruction. Then they taught students a correction plan. So they said, blend words with the taught rules, ask, is this a word I know? And then to select a different pronunciation for graphemes that flip. They didn't say it this way exactly, but the idea was that they taught students that some letters make different sounds, like A can say A and A, EA can say E and A, and so on. And then blend the word again and ask if that's a word that they know. So they taught them that correction plan. And then separately, they did an activity where they taught, they had the students listen to the teacher, say words incorrectly, and have the teacher correct them. So Simon says, touch your nose, ear, shoulder, and the students had to say the correct word. So it's literally a separate activity where students are just looking at the at correctly pronouncing spoken words. And so you can see in both of these, the Dyson and the Savage, they're talking literally about adding into a typical reading instructional sequence a component focused on correcting mispronunciations. And in both of these studies, they have positive effects on student outcomes compared with students who didn't participate in this kind of instruction, but did other parts of it, just didn't do the mispronunciation correction. So there seems to be some evidence that that is helpful to do. So that is all well, I have plenty more to say, but that's all I have in the presentation. So I'll see what we have for questions, and I know